The house had that kind of stillness I used to love. Quiet mornings where the smell of coffee mixed with the faint sound of birds outside the window. But now it felt empty. Cold. A silence that no amount of sunlight could warm. I stared at Olivia across the kitchen table, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, framing the face I used to memorize like scripture. She was scrolling through her phone, one hand absently stirring her coffee. She hadn't looked up at me once since she sat down. "You're quiet," I said, trying to inject something into the void. A half-hearted attempt at normalcy. She glanced up, her blue eyes sharp but distant. "Just thinking about work," she said, too casually. "Big deadlines coming up." "Work. Always work." I nodded and took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. "Anything I can help with?" That earned me a tight smile. "Not unless you suddenly know how to create marketing campaigns." She chuckled at her own joke, but it didn't reach her eyes. That was Liv these days, polished, distant, and impossible to reach. 25 years. That's how long we'd been married. High school sweethearts, bound together by years of memories, shared dreams, and a lifetime of inside jokes. Or at least, that's what I thought. Lately, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was holding onto something that had already slipped through my fingers. "I was thinking about the party on Saturday," I said, keeping my voice even. "Do you want me to come with you?" She froze for just a moment, the spoon clinking against her mug. Then she shook her head, a little too quickly. "You don't have to. It's just a work thing." "Boring, really." Still, I pressed, watching her closely. "I could use a night out. Meet some of your coworkers." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Honestly, Matt, it's not that kind of party. You'd be bored out of your mind." I didn't push further, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Liv was a smooth liar, but I'd been watching her closely enough to catch the tiny tells. The way her eyes darted just a little to the left. The way her fingers fidgeted with the handle of her mug. She wasn't just distracted. She was hiding something. I wanted to call her out right then and there, demand to know what the hell was going on. But I bit my tongue. Liv wasn't the type of person you corner, she was the type you studied. And I'd learned long ago that patience was my strongest weapon. The rest of the week passed in a haze of routine. Work, errands, dinner at the table with Liv barely speaking and our daughter Emma texting her fiancé between bites of salad. Emma was 21 now, engaged to a guy named Nate, a clean-cut, blue-eyed charmer from a family that probably vacationed in the Hamptons. The kid was fine, I guess, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he looked at life like a perfectly planned spreadsheet. "Dad," Emma said one night as we cleared the table. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one where you're pretending you don't hate Nate." I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't hate Nate." She narrowed her eyes at me, skeptical. "Sure. And I'm not dying inside because Mom keeps making me pick table settings for a wedding that's 2 years away." Liv walked in at that moment, her heels clicking against the floor, wine glass in hand. "Emma," she said in that clipped tone she used when she was annoyed. "Don't exaggerate. We're just planning ahead." Emma rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath before leaving the room. I looked at Liv, who seemed more focused on her wine than anything else. "You're pushing her too hard," I said gently. "She's young," Liv replied, sipping her drink. "She needs structure. Otherwise, she'll procrastinate, and nothing will get done." I wanted to argue, but I let it go. These days, every conversation with Liv felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. One wrong word, and everything would come crashing down. Saturday night came, and Liv looked stunning. Too stunning. The tight black dress she wore hugged every curve, and her hair fell in perfect waves that framed her striking blue eyes. She looked like someone about to step onto a red carpet, not a work event. "You look amazing," I said, unable to hide the edge in my voice. She smiled, but it was hollow. "Thanks. Sure you don't want me to come with you?" She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Matt, please. I told you, it's just a boring work thing." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a cloud of her floral perfume and the faint sound of her heels clicking against the driveway. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. My gut told me something was wrong, had been wrong for months, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I felt like a man standing on the shore, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop them. That night, I sat in the living room with a glass of bourbon, staring at the blank TV screen. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I picked it up, hoping it was Liv. It wasn't. It was a text from Emma. "Is Mom coming home late again?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. After a moment, I typed back, "Probably. She's got her thing." Emma didn't respond, but her silence said enough. I finished my drink and went to bed, the sheets cold and empty on Liv's side. I tried not to think about where she was or who she was with, but the thoughts came anyway, creeping in like shadows under the door. By the time Liv came home, it was past midnight. I heard the garage door open, followed by the faint shuffle of her heels on the floor. I stayed in bed, feigning sleep as she slipped under the covers. Her perfume was stronger than usual. Different, too. Almost like she'd reapplied it. I lay there, my heart pounding, the question burning in my throat. "Who were you with tonight, Liv?" But I didn't ask. Not yet. Saturday had passed, but the unease lingered. It settled into my chest like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. By the time Monday rolled around, I was back at work, sitting through endless meetings about quarterly projections, but my mind wasn't on spreadsheets or account balances. It was on Liv. I replayed her words from the week before over and over, "You don't have to come. It's boring." She was lying. I could feel it in my gut, a gnawing certainty that grew with every passing hour. I just didn't know what the lie was hiding, yet. The following evening, Liv breezed into the house, her smile tight, her hair still perfect despite the long day. She tossed her purse onto the counter and poured herself a glass of wine like she didn't have a care in the world. "How was the party?" I asked casually, my eyes fixed on her. She froze for half a second, long enough for me to notice. "Fine. Same old work stuff. You didn't mention much about it." "There's not much to say." She sipped her wine, her gaze flicking away from mine. "Just networking and small talk. Nothing interesting." Her words were calm, but her tone was rehearsed. That's when I decided I needed to stop asking questions and start getting answers. That Friday, her company had another event, an awards dinner or something similar. Liv told me about it that morning while she packed a sleek black clutch, her tone deliberately casual. "You sure you don't want me to come?" I asked, leaning in the doorway of our bedroom. "Matt, come on. You hate these things," she said, slipping her lipstick into the bag without meeting my eyes. "You always say corporate events are a waste of time." I said that years ago. Maybe I've changed. Her hands stilled for just a moment before she smiled, soft, practiced, empty. "Don't be silly. I'll be back before you know it." But I wasn't about to sit at home again, stewing in silence. I waited until she left, the sound of her heels echoing through the house like the ticking of a bomb. Then I grabbed my jacket and followed her. The venue was a swanky downtown hotel, all marble floors and glittering chandeliers. I parked across the street and waited, watching the stream of well-dressed people filter through the front doors. And then, there she was. Liv stepped out of her car, her dress clinging to her in ways that turned heads. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, catching the soft glow of the streetlights. But it wasn't her elegance that struck me, it was the man who approached her. He was tall, early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that screamed money. He walked up to her with the kind of confidence that made my stomach turn. "And Liv?" She smiled. A real smile, the kind I hadn't seen from her in years. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I watched them exchange a few words before walking into the hotel together. Who the hell was he? I didn't follow them inside. Not yet. Instead, I sat there, staring at the revolving doors, every nerve in my body on edge. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from Emma. "You okay, Dad?" I didn't respond. I wasn't okay. Not even close. An hour passed before I finally stepped out of the car, my heart pounding. The concierge barely looked at me as I slipped through the lobby and into the grand ballroom. The place was packed. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Liv stood near the far end of the room, her hand resting lightly on the man's arm as they spoke to a small group of people. I forced myself to stay in the shadows, watching every interaction. The way she leaned in when he spoke. The way his hand brushed against hers, lingering just a second too long. The knot in my stomach tightened as Liv's laughter rang out, light, carefree, and intimate. It wasn't the kind of laughter she shared with me anymore. When the speeches began, the lights dimmed, and the crowd shifted their focus to the stage. That's when I saw them slip out, together. I followed, keeping my distance as they moved through the halls. They stopped outside a private lounge, and the man leaned in close, his hand on Liv's waist. My chest tightened as I saw her tilt her head up, her lips moving softly. And then she said it. "I'm sorry, darling." The word darling echoed in my head like a gunshot. I didn't need to see more. I turned on my heel and walked out of the hotel, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Who was this man to her? How long had this been going on? The questions churned in my mind as I drove home, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. By the time I reached the driveway, my anger had hardened into something cold and sharp. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The morning after the party, Liv moved through the house like nothing had happened. She made coffee, hummed a soft tune, and kissed my cheek on her way out the door. Her lips lingered a little longer than usual, like she was trying to prove something. But I wasn't fooled. As soon as she left, I made the call. Eric Lawson wasn't the kind of man you found in the yellow pages. He came recommended through a friend of a friend, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. When I walked into his office, I wasn't sure what to expect. The place was small, clean, and devoid of any personal touches. Just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a file cabinet that looked older than I was. Eric himself was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod as he gestured for me to sit. "Matt Carter," he said, his voice gravelly. "You've got a problem." It wasn't a question. I nodded, sliding a photo of Liv across the desk. "My wife. I think she's having an affair." He picked up the photo, studying it with an expression that gave nothing away. "You want proof?" "I want the truth." He nodded again, leaning back in his chair. "I'll need a timeline. Any suspicions, odd behavior, recent changes. Everything." For the next hour, I laid it all out. The late nights, the dodged questions, the company parties. The man from the hotel. Every detail felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest, but I forced myself to push through it. Eric listened without interruption, jotting down notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands on the desk. "This won't be cheap," he said bluntly. "I don't care." He nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. "Give me a week." The next few days were hell. Liv acted like nothing was wrong, filling the house with the sound of her voice and the clink of wine glasses in the evenings. Emma called once, chirping about wedding venues and floral arrangements, her voice full of excitement. I could barely bring myself to respond. At night, Liv lay next to me, her breathing slow and even as I stared at the ceiling. My mind raced with images of her and the man from the hotel, his hand on her waist, her lips forming the word darling. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white, but the anger did nothing to drown out the pain. Eric called me on the 5th day. "I've got something," he said, his voice steady. "Meet me at my office." I didn't hesitate. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him, my heart pounding as he slid a manila folder across the desk. "This is just the start," he said. "There's more, but this should be enough to confirm your suspicions." I opened the folder, my hands trembling. The first photo hit me like a punch to the gut, Liv, stepping out of a car in front of a motel. Her black dress clung to her frame, and she was smiling, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. The next photo showed her walking arm in arm with the man from the hotel. Ryan Brooks. His name was scrawled in Eric's neat handwriting at the bottom of the page. There were more photos, Liv and Ryan at a coffee shop, sharing a quiet moment on a park bench, their hands brushing. In each one, she looked relaxed. Happy. Free. And then came the videos. Eric clicked play on his laptop, and the grainy footage showed Liv and Ryan walking into the motel together. They didn't bother to hide their closeness. His hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her inside. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. I felt sick. "She's been meeting him regularly," Eric said, his voice calm but firm. "Mostly during lunch breaks. Always the same motel. Same routine." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. My wife, the woman I'd built a life with, was living a double life. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Eric asked. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes." The next week brought more updates, each one worse than the last. Liv wasn't just sneaking off for lunch dates. There were text messages, intercepted phone calls, even recordings of her laughing with Ryan about their office wife arrangement. "Matt would never suspect," she said in one recording, her voice light and carefree. "He's too busy with work." The words cut deeper than anything else. She hadn't just betrayed me, she'd underestimated me. Written me off as a clueless fool. By the time Eric handed me the final report, I was numb. I flipped through the pages, each photo and transcript blurring together until they felt like one long, unbroken nightmare. "She's been seeing him for over a year," Eric said, his tone even. "It's not a fling. This is serious." I sat back in the chair, the weight of it all pressing down on me. My marriage, my family, my entire life, it had all been a lie. "What do you want to do?" Eric asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. What did I want to do? Scream? Cry? Burn it all to the ground? But as I sat there, staring at the pile of evidence in front of me, one thought rose above the chaos. I wasn't going to let her win. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, the manila folder with Eric's report sitting on the nightstand like a time bomb waiting to go off. Liv was curled up on her side of the bed, her back to me, her breathing slow and even. She slept so easily, so peacefully, while I felt like I was suffocating. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. Over breakfast, I slid the folder across the table. Liv froze mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. She glanced at the folder, then at me, her blue eyes narrowing. "What's this?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Open it," I said, my tone cold and unrelenting. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the folder. The moment she saw the first photo, her face drained of color. She flipped through the pages, each one hitting her like a physical blow. By the time she reached the transcripts, her hands were shaking. "Matt," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This isn't." "Don't," I cut her off, slamming my hand down on the table. "Don't insult me by lying again." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at me, tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. "Not this time." "How long?" I demanded, my voice sharp and cold. "How long have you been lying to me? To Emma? To this entire goddamn family?" Liv wiped at her tears, her composure slipping. "Matt, it's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like? You've been sneaking off to a motel with Ryan for over a year. I have photos, videos, texts, everything. So don't you dare sit there and pretend this is something it's not." She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "It was a mistake," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I spat, my anger boiling over. "You called him darling. You laughed about how I'd never suspect. Was that a mistake too?" Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't let up. "I gave you everything, Liv. 25 years of my life. And this is how you repay me?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I still love you," she said, her voice trembling. "It didn't mean anything. It was just..." "Just what?" I snapped. "Just sex? Just lies? Don't try to minimize this, Liv. Don't you dare." Her silence was deafening. I leaned back in my chair, my chest heaving, my heart pounding like a war drum. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You didn't just betray me, you betrayed Emma. Our family. Everything we built together." At the mention of Emma, Liv's sobs turned to hiccups. "Please, Matt," she whispered. "Please don't tell her." I stared at her, disgusted by her audacity. "Oh, I won't have to tell her," I said. "You will." That evening, I called Emma and asked her to come over. She arrived a couple of hours later, her face lighting up as she walked into the kitchen. "What's going on?" she asked, setting her bag on the counter. Liv sat at the table, her eyes red and swollen. She hadn't moved since our conversation that morning. When Emma noticed her mother's state, her smile faltered. "Mom? What's wrong?" I gestured for Emma to sit. She glanced between us, confused, but obeyed. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked. I crossed my arms, my expression stony. "Your mother has something to tell you." Emma's brows furrowed as she turned to Liv. "Mom?" Liv shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Matt, please." "Tell her," I said sharply. Liv's shoulders sagged in defeat. She looked at Emma, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake," she said, her words trembling. I've been seeing someone." Emma blinked, her confusion morphing into disbelief. "What? What are you talking about?" "I cheated," Liv said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I never meant for you to." "You cheated?" Emma's voice rose, sharp and incredulous. "On Dad?" Liv nodded, her tears falling freely. "It was a mistake," she repeated. "I didn't mean..." "Stop saying that," Emma shouted, her face flushed with anger. You didn't mean to? What does that even mean? How could you? Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I stepped forward, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder, but she shrugged it off. How long? She demanded, glaring at Liv. How long has this been going on? Liv hesitated, her silence answering the question for her. Emma stood abruptly, knocking her chair over in the process. I can't believe you, she said, her voice trembling with rage. I trusted you. We trusted you. How could you do this to us? Emma, please, Liv pleaded, reaching out for her. I love you. I love your father. Don't, Emma snapped, stepping back. Don't say you love us. If you loved us, you wouldn't have done this. Emma stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything I'd ever known. Liv crumpled in her chair, her sobs filling the void. I stood there, watching her, feeling nothing but anger and resentment. You wanted this life, I said coldly. Now you can deal with the consequences. I walked out of the room, leaving Liv to drown in her own guilt. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something close to relief. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The house had changed after that night. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, and the distance between all of us grew wider by the day. Liv moved through the halls like a ghost, her shoulders hunched, her eyes perpetually red. Emma barely spoke to either of us, locking herself in her room and only emerging to grab her keys or a quick bite to eat. And me? I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, my anger still simmering beneath the surface. But the quiet didn't last. It started with Emma's fiancé, Nate. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, when Emma walked in, her face set with that stubborn determination I'd known since she was a child. Dad, we need to talk, she said, crossing her arms. About? The wedding, she replied, her tone clipped. Mom and I were discussing the guest list, and we think Ryan should be there. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. Slowly, I set it down, meeting her gaze. You think who should be there? Ryan, she said again, as if saying his name wasn't like pouring salt into an open wound. He's important to Mom, and she wants him there. I laughed, short, bitter, and humorless. Let me get this straight. You want the man who destroyed our family to come to your wedding? To sit in the same room as me and pretend everything's fine? Emma sighed, her arms dropping to her sides. Dad, it's not that simple. Mom made a mistake, but she's still my mother. And Ryan, he's part of her life now. Part of her life? I repeated, my voice rising. Emma, he's the reason our life is falling apart. Stop being so dramatic, she snapped, her eyes narrowing. People have affairs all the time. It doesn't mean you have to ruin everything over it. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm ruining everything? Me? Emma, your mother lied to me for a year. She betrayed me. And now you want to reward her by inviting her lover to your wedding? Dad, I'm not choosing sides, she said, but her tone betrayed her. I just want things to be civil. Civil, I muttered, shaking my head. Fine. If you want Ryan there, then you can consider me uninvited. Emma's mouth fell open, her face a mix of shock and frustration. Dad, don't do this. No, I said firmly, crossing my arms. You want him to play father of the bride? Go ahead. But don't expect me to sit there and watch. Emma stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stayed where I was, staring at the empty room, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. It wasn't just Liv who had betrayed me now, it was Emma too. That evening, Nate called me. I was surprised to see his name flash on my phone, and for a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But something told me to answer. "Hey, Nate," I said cautiously. "Mr. Carter," he replied, his voice unusually stiff. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "Sure. What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind that stretched long enough to make you uneasy. "Emma told me what's been going on. About Liv. And Ryan." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I see. She also told me about the wedding. About wanting to invite him. And I don't think I can go through with this," he admitted, his voice low. "Not like this." My eyes snapped open. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this isn't the life I signed up for," he said, his tone growing more resolute. "I love Emma, but if she's okay with this kind of betrayal, what does that say about us? About our future?" For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of hope. "Nate, listen to me. Emma's a good person, but right now, she's caught in the middle of something she doesn't fully understand. Don't make any rash decisions." "It's not rash," he said. "I've been thinking about this for days. And honestly, Mr. Carter, I think you're right to stand your ground. Ryan doesn't belong at that wedding. And if Emma can't see that, then maybe she and I aren't as compatible as I thought." I wanted to argue, to tell him to stay, to fight for Emma like I couldn't fight for Liv. But the words didn't come. Instead, I said the only thing I could. "Do what you think is best, Nate." The fallout came the next morning. Emma burst into the house, her face streaked with tears. She shoved her phone in my face, the screen displaying a text from Nate. "I'm sorry, Emma. I can't do this anymore. Take care of yourself." "You talked to him, didn't you?" she accused, her voice trembling. "You poisoned him against me." "I didn't poison anyone," I said calmly. "Nate made his own decision." "Bullshit," she shouted, her hands shaking. "You couldn't handle me siding with Mom, so you sabotaged my relationship." I stood my ground, my voice steady. "Emma, if Nate couldn't handle the truth, then maybe he wasn't the right person for you." Her face crumpled, and she let out a frustrated scream before running upstairs. I didn't follow. There was no point. That evening, Liv tried to talk to me. She stood in the doorway of my office, her eyes rimmed with red. "Matt, we need to stop this," she said, her voice breaking. "We're tearing this family apart." I looked up at her, my anger reigniting. "You think I'm tearing this family apart? Liv, you set the whole damn thing on fire." "I didn't mean." "Stop saying that." I snapped, slamming my hand on the desk. "You meant every lie you told, every time you snuck off to be with him. You made your choices, Liv. And now we're all paying for them." She stepped back, her shoulders sagging. "I want to fix this," she whispered. "But I can't give him up. I need you to understand that." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I stared at her, my voice cold and final. "If you want him, you can have him. But you can't have me." The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Liv's betrayal had shattered the life I thought we had, and Emma's misplaced loyalty had cut deeper than I ever thought possible. But somewhere in that darkness, a cold, sharp resolve had taken hold. If they wanted to tear me apart, I wouldn't make it easy for them. I started with the finances. Liv had always left the money to me, content to let me handle the details of our savings, investments, and expenses. She liked to joke that I was the CFO of our family, but now I saw it for what it was, a blind trust one could use to my advantage. The first step was moving money into accounts she couldn't touch. Offshore, untraceable, and completely under my control. I didn't care about the legality of it anymore. I wasn't going to let her walk away with half of everything I'd built. Next, I looked at the house. The mortgage was long paid off, but I took out a line of credit against it without telling her. I poured every penny into accounts in my name, leaving the debt squarely on her shoulders. If she wanted to keep the house after this, she'd have to figure it out herself. I didn't stop there. Liv's BMW was still technically in both of our names, so I leveraged it too, taking out a loan against its value. I sent the money into a separate account and made a note to myself to cancel the payments before I disappeared. During those weeks, Liv seemed almost oblivious. She moved through the house with the weary air of someone trying to hold things together, still clinging to the idea that we could fix what was broken. She even started cooking again, filling the kitchen with the smells of our old life: roasted chicken, freshly baked bread, pasta sauces simmering on the stove. I sat through those dinners like a stranger in my own home, nodding at her attempts at conversation while quietly finalizing my plans. She didn't notice the papers I brought home, the calls I made, or the hours I spent locked in my office. And if she did, she didn't ask. One evening, as Liv sat across from me at the dining table, twirling her wine glass between her fingers, she said something that nearly made me laugh. "I think we can get through this," she said softly, her voice hopeful. "I know I've made mistakes, but I still believe in us." I looked at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, and I felt nothing. "Do you?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "Yes," she said quickly. "I know it'll take time, but if we really try, we can fix this." Her words hung in the air like a bad joke. I leaned back in my chair, studying her, trying to figure out if she actually believed what she was saying or if it was just another lie. "Liv," I said finally, "you don't want to fix this. You want to have it all, me, Ryan, this house, the life we built. But it doesn't work like that." Her smile faltered. "I don't want Ryan. I want us." "You don't get to make that decision anymore," I said coldly. "Not after everything you've done." She didn't respond. Instead, she looked down at her plate, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Good. The final piece of my plan fell into place when Eric sent me a package in the mail. Inside was everything he'd found: photos, videos, transcripts, and a detailed report outlining Liv's affair with Ryan. It was damning, and it was exactly what I needed to ensure she wouldn't win. I sent copies to Ryan's wife, Jessica. She deserved to know the truth, and I wanted to see how their perfect little arrangement would hold up under the weight of her wrath. Within days, it all came crashing down. Ryan's wife filed for divorce, taking him for everything he had. She went to his boss, who just so happened to be her cousin, and made sure he lost his job. By the end of the week, Ryan was living out of a cheap motel, his flashy car repossessed, and his future in ruins. Liv didn't say a word when the news reached her. I watched her sit at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone, reading the fallout in real time. "What did you expect?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. "That you could have him and everything would stay the same?" She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I never wanted this." "Didn't you?" I said quietly, my voice cutting through her excuses like a knife. "You didn't think about what would happen when it all came out? Or did you just not care?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The final blow came when I handed her the divorce papers. I had drawn them up through Sarah, my sister, who was a divorce lawyer with a reputation for being ruthless. The terms were brutal: Liv would keep the house, but she'd be saddled with the debt. The car would be repossessed, and she'd have no claim to the money I'd secured for myself. She stared at the papers, her hands shaking as she read through them. "Matt," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't do this." "Can I?" I said, my tone icy. "You made your choice, Liv. This is mine." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't have anything left." "That's not my problem," I replied, walking out of the room. The house felt heavier than ever. The rooms that once echoed with laughter were now filled with silence, broken only by the faint hum of appliances and the occasional shuffle of feet. Liv hadn't left the house in days. She moved through it like a shadow, her once flawless appearance replaced by an unkempt shell of the woman I used to know. Emma had packed a bag and moved in with a friend after Nate ended their engagement. I hadn't heard from her since she left. It hurt more than I'd admit, but I told myself it was for the best. I couldn't afford to focus on her anymore. I had my own battles to fight. The day the bank notice arrived, Liv found it before I did. I was in the garage, packing the last of my things into a duffel bag, when I heard her voice echo through the house. "Matt." I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I took my time walking inside, my footsteps deliberate, steady. She was standing in the kitchen, a piece of paper clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the letter. I took it from her, scanning the bold print. It was the notification for the loan against the house, detailing the sizable debt now attached to it. I folded it neatly and set it on the counter. "It's a loan," I said simply. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "A loan? Against the house? How could you?" I shrugged. "It's all in the paperwork. You signed off on it." Her jaw dropped. "I didn't sign anything." "You did," I said calmly. "Remember that night we had wine, and I told you it was part of a new insurance policy? You didn't even read it." The realization hit her like a freight train. She staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "You tricked me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You planned this." "I planned everything," I replied, my voice cold and even. "The house, the car, the savings, it's all under your name now. Enjoy the debt." "Matt," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't do this. I know I hurt you, but we can still fix this." "We can." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop. We're past that. You wanted Ryan, Liv. You wanted the life you thought he could give you. Well, now you have it. Debt, ruined reputation, and all." She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her betrayal. Ryan wasn't faring any better. The fallout from his wife's discovery had left him jobless, homeless, and alone. I'd heard through mutual contacts that he was driving for a rideshare company, his polished image now a distant memory. The satisfaction I felt was fleeting, but it was there. The final blow to Liv's life came when I sent the evidence of her affair to her boss. I hadn't planned to, but something about the way she still tried to cling to her dignity, to the illusion that she was a victim, pushed me over the edge. Her boss, a no-nonsense woman with little tolerance for scandal, called her into the office the next day. By the evening, Liv came home with her belongings in a cardboard box. She didn't say a word to me as she set it down on the dining table, her shoulders hunched, her eyes hollow. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly, not looking at me. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I did." Emma returned a week later, her face etched with anger and betrayal. "You destroyed her," she accused, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "You destroyed everything." She destroyed it first, I replied. I just made sure she paid for it. Emma shook her head, her expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. You're so blinded by your anger, you can't even see what you've done. To me. To her. To all of us. You sided with her, Emma, I said, my voice cold. You wanted to invite her lover to your wedding. You made your choice. Now live with it. She turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow her. I didn't have the energy anymore. The house was empty now. Liv had moved into a dingy apartment on the other side of town. Emma hadn't spoken to me since she left, and the echo of their absence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. For the first time in years, I was alone. And it felt like freedom. The sun was warm against my face as I stepped out of the truck, the Florida breeze carrying the faint scent of salt water. The trailer I'd bought sat nestled under a cluster of palm trees, its silver exterior glinting in the sunlight. It wasn't much, just a modest travel trailer parked at the edge of a quiet RV park, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's shadow. I had started over. The first few weeks in Florida were strange. The emptiness I'd felt back in Texas had followed me here, like a ghost haunting my every step. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear Liv's voice or the faint hum of Emma's late-night television. But the silence was absolute, and I was alone with my thoughts. At first, the loneliness was unbearable. I spent hours walking along the beach, the sand crunching under my boots, the waves crashing in the distance. I thought about everything, Liv's betrayal, Emma's anger, the life I had worked so hard to build and then destroyed piece by piece. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The weight on my chest felt a little lighter. The air smelled a little sweeter. The world didn't feel as sharp, as hostile. I wasn't just free from Liv and her lies. I was free from the man I had been with her. I found a job with a construction company, managing accounts and overseeing projects. The work was steady, the pay was good, and my coworkers were the kind of no-nonsense people who didn't pry into your personal life. It was exactly what I needed, a distraction, a purpose, a way to keep moving forward. At night, I'd sit on the steps of my trailer, a cold beer in hand, and watch the stars. The Florida sky was different from the one back home. Brighter. Wider. It made me feel small, but not in a bad way. More like a reminder that the world was vast and full of possibilities. Liv called once. I saw her name flash on my phone and let it ring. She left a voicemail, her voice shaky, filled with half apologies and thinly veiled desperation. Matt, she said, her words punctuated by long pauses. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I hope someday you can forgive me. I deleted the message without responding. Forgiveness wasn't in the cards, not yet, maybe not ever. Emma didn't call. Part of me wanted to reach out, to explain why I'd done what I did, but I knew it wouldn't matter. She had made her choice, just like I had made mine. I could only hope that someday she'd understand. A month passed, then two. The pain of everything I'd lost dulled to a quiet ache, like an old injury that flared up every now and then but no longer consumed me. I started to feel like myself again, or maybe someone entirely new. Someone who wasn't defined by a marriage, a house, or a family. One evening, as I sat outside watching the sun dip below the horizon, my neighbor, a woman named Karen, walked over with a plate of cookies. She was in her early 50s, with short-cropped hair and a laugh that could fill a room. Thought you might like these, she said, handing me the plate. You're always out here alone. Figured you could use some company. I smiled, accepting the plate. Thanks. She sat down beside me, her presence warm and easy. We talked about nothing in particular: her job as a nurse, my work in construction, the quirks of the RV park's residents. For the first time in what felt like forever, the conversation didn't feel heavy or forced. When she left, I realized I was smiling. As the weeks turned into months, I began to build a life here. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I made friends, found a rhythm, and learned to let go of the anger that had once defined me. The past still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I thought of Liv less and less. When I did, it wasn't with hatred or regret, it was with a kind of weary acceptance. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. But there was peace in moving forward. On the 1-year anniversary of the day I left Texas, I stood on the beach, the waves lapping at my feet. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the salty air filling my lungs. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of what I'd lost. I felt the promise of what lay ahead. Freedom had come at a price, one I'd paid in love, trust, and family. But standing there, with the world stretching out before me, I knew it had been worth it.